Opening the center creates immediate pawn tension, influencing piece development for both sides. Establishing central pawn presence immediately contests white's initial territorial claim, setting the stage for a strategic pawn battle across the board. Asserting central dominion, this pawn thrust immediately contests the d-pawn, aiming to unravel black's solid foundation and open lines for queenside pressure. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop the queen's knight and support the central pawn structure in a classic queen's gambit declined setup. Developing the knight to c3 fortifies the central pawn structure and prepares for kingside expansion. Developing the knight to its most active square prepares for pawn advances and central control, aiming for harmonious piece deployment. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside development while relinquishing the initiative. Building a fianchettoed bishop on the long diagonal offers significant counterplay. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling while keeping options open for pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to g7 establishes a formidable kingside fianchetto, perfectly fitting into the slavey structure. Developing the bishop here prepares to castle and eyes potential kingside pawn pushes. Securing the king's safety initiates a prudent defense, preparing for potential central pawn pushes and freeing the rook. Castling on the queenside initiates a pawn storm race, anticipating an open kingside for your opponent. Initiating queenside expansion prepares to challenge the center pawn structure and develop the bishop to a more active diagonal. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now prepares for the eventual expansion with a4, creating space and support for the c4 pawn. The bishop now eyes the long diagonal, reinforcing the central dark squares and preparing for future pawn advances. A bold bishop repositioning, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the open diagonal. Repositioning the rook offers defensive support and prepares for potential central pawn advances. Anchoring the rook to the semi-open file, white prepares to generate pressure along the c-file, potentially targeting black's queenside pawn structure. Reinforcing the center's pawn structure opens avenues for further development, preparing to challenge white's central space. Bringing the queen to the e2 square prepares for a kingside pawn storm or reinforces the central structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside expansion with the knight's repositioning. Readying the central file for a decisive advance, this redeployment enhances rook mobility and prepares for potential pawn thrusts. A thoughtful repositioning to activate the queen, aiming to support potential queenside expansion and potentially trade off white's active bishop. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate kingside advances by black and offers a subtle but important psychological advantage. Asserting queenside space, this pawn prepares to challenge white's control of that flank. Reclaiming the diagonal offers flexibility while solidifying pawn structure and preparing for central pawn pushes. Challenging the queenside pawn structure opens avenues for queenside counterplay and weakens white's central grip. Opening the c-file creates immediate dynamic possibilities, forcing a pawn exchange that alters the central pawn structure. Opening that e-file can bring immediate pressure, but watch out for isolated pawns. Repositioning the bishop to b1 aims to improve its scope along the long diagonal and prepare for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvers. Developing the queen to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially launch an attack. Opening lines for a tactical skirmish, capturing a pawn to potentially seize the open c-file and target the queenside. Unlocking the long diagonal for your queen now, but relinquishing the central pawn structure demands careful maneuvering. Asserting control over the queenside, this knight foray immediately pressures black's pawn structure and opens avenues for aggressive queenside expansion. Opening the center decisively with this pawn thrust seizes space and initiates immediate tactical skirmishes. Reclaiming the central tension, this repositioning prepares to contest the d-file and supports a potential kingside pawn push. This maneuver opens up the knight to the central battlefield, creating immediate tactical possibilities and challenging white's control. Repositioning the knight to nc4 bolsters central influence and prepares for potential queenside pressure. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal power, aiming to exploit white's somewhat cramped queenside. Liberating the queen from passive observation unlocks potential counterplay, aiming to exploit the slightly uncoordinated black pieces. Instigating a tactical melee, this knight ventures into a potentially overloaded square, creating immediate pressure on white's central structure. Unleashing the queen to target the weak e6 pawn and prepare for further central infiltration. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position, but unwisely allows white's knight to reach a more active outpost. Opening the b-file with the pawn allows queenside infiltration and pressures black's isolated pawns. Exploiting the captured pawn's space, black aggressively opens diagonals, hoping to disrupt white's queenside coordination and create an immediate pawn majority. Sacrificing the bishop frees the dark-squared diagonal for the queen and opens lines for your rooks. Unleashing your king, albeit temporarily, to occupy the central files offers potential counterplay and opens avenues for piece activity. Reclaiming the central pawn structure opens up the f-file, offering immediate attacking possibilities against the exposed black king. Reclaiming the central pawn and activating the knight offers dynamic counterplay. Restricting the knight's scope on the queen side is a concession for future central control. Reclaiming central influence, the knight repositions to bolster the queen side and eye the weakened white pawn structure. Unlocking the center, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's weakened light squares and seeks to fracture the opposing pawn structure. The knight's journey to b6 repositions it for a potential central advance or to contest the a4 pawn's dominance. Exploiting the open d-file, this knight's advance aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and centralize forces. Releasing the pinned knight, black aims to reactivate the crippled queenside and challenge white's central control. Unleashing the passed pawn, this advances aggressively, aiming to disrupt black's piece harmony. Reclaiming central influence, this knight repositions to contest the d-file and support an eventual advance. This advance aims to stifle black's knight and potentially create a passed pawn. Reclaiming space on the queenside after the pawn exchange is the immediate goal. Clearing the way for the rook to activate and contest the open c-file. Introducing the rook to the open file, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside dominance. Shifting the queen aims to improve attacking potential on the kingside, targeting black's slightly exposed monarch. Seizing the open file, black initiates a bold exchange that could unravel white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay on the queenside. Regaining the exchange, white simplifies into an endgame where their passed pawn on a5 becomes a significant long-term threat. A bold counterthrust, snatching the open file and challenging white's overextended knight. Regaining the lost pawn by force, aiming to simplify and neutralize black's powerful knight. A daring queen sacrifice to shatter the pawn structure, aiming for a positional advantage in the ensuing endgame. Securing the open file now allows white to eye black's vulnerable king, while black's knight is trapped. Opening the c-file allows the rook to pressure the isolated pawn, a crucial target in the coming endgame struggle. Unleashing a powerful rook to pry open files and pressure the isolated black queen. Attempting to regroup pieces by activating the rook on the 6th rank, though it might offer limited counterplay. Activating the queen on this open diagonal creates immediate pressure on black's isolated pawns and aims to exploit the weakened kingside. Shifting the queen to the e-file aims to regroup and prepare for potential central pawn pushes, while also offering support. The rook now invades the 7th rank, severing black's queen and creating immediate pressure on the king. Reactivating the queen to the queenside offers counterplay along the newly opened file. Unleashing pressure on the open c-file, this queen repositioning is a bold, tactical gamble aimed at disrupting black's coordination and threatening the isolated pawn. A necessary surrender of material to prevent catastrophic pawn breakthroughs. Securing the open file with the rook now initiates the endgame, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Navigating the endgame, the black king must actively participate and seek safety amidst the open lines. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank immediately pressures the weakened black king and prepares to exploit the open files. Reclaiming the 7th rank is a vital defensive maneuver, securing the king from further intrusion. Consolidating the rook to the 8th rank reclaims the initiative and pressures black's king. The king seeks refuge on the open central files, aiming to escape the encroaching enemy knights. Controlling the open d-file now becomes paramount for the rooks. Activating the rook on the 7th rank, a classic endgame maneuver aiming to disrupt white's position. Controlling the open file, white aims to sever the black king's escape routes. King's safety now becomes the paramount concern, as the rook on the 7th rank threatens to infiltrate. Asserting control over the open b-file, this rook swing aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses. Sacrificing the rook opens a dangerous diagonal for the white queen and exposes the king. Securing the king's safety is paramount, as the endgame looms and the monarch needs a secure refuge. Unlocking the f-file opens a crucial line for the black rook, finally bringing it into a more active role. The monarch ventures out, seeking active participation in the waning conflict. Focusing on the endgame transition, bringing the rook to the 7th rank opens crucial lines. Pressing into the 7th rank, the rook aims to cut off the black king and disrupt any defensive setup. Freeing the f-pawn unlocks the black king's potential activity in this tense endgame. Capturing the pawn opens a decisive file, a critical advantage as the endgame approaches. The knight retreats, seeking refuge from the encroaching pawns and preparing to re-enter the fray on a more active square. Unleashing the rook, white seeks to dislodge black's king and exploit the open files. Seeking refuge for the king amidst the encroaching pawns, this maneuver attempts to reorganize its defense. Knight sacrifice opens the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the exposed king. The black king, now exposed, faces immediate threats on the open files as the rooks dominate. Snapping up that pawn immediately simplifies the position, forcing the opponent to react to the opened file. The rook now aims to blockade the passed pawn, a crucial defensive task in this endgame. Securing the kingside is paramount after that pawn sacrifice, preventing black's knight from probing further. The king's exposed position after the pawn push invites this aggressive check, seeking to disrupt white's coordination and gain tempo. Consolidating the king activity is paramount now, seeking safety from any lingering rook pressure. Unleashing a pawn to chase the king, hoping to exploit the open files for a decisive attack. Snatching that pawn opens a direct assault on black's weakened king position. Abandoning the defended 7th rank, the black king enters a precarious central outpost under the watchful eye of the rook and pawn. Capturing the pawn immediately opens the file for rook activity, pressuring black's remaining pawns. The rook embarks on an infiltration, probing for weaknesses in white's newly reorganized pawn structure. Dominating the open file with the rook prevents counterplay and prepares to activate the king. Activating the rook to eye the vulnerable enemy monarch offers immediate attacking potential. Advancing the pawn forces black's rook to a passive square, preparing for a decisive pawn push. Seeking a desperate check to disrupt the advancing king's safe passage. Relocating the monarch to the 2nd rank solidifies its safety while preparing for potential pawn advancements. Sacrificing material to activate the rook and force the king out is a bold choice. The king makes a dash for safety, seeking refuge on the queen side. Sacrificing material to open a path for the king is a desperate gamble, but it's the only chance. Pawns marching forward now, aiming to create a passed threat. The king boldly ventures forward, seeking refuge and activation amidst the lingering threats on the board. Advancing the pawn secures the opposition and prepares to infiltrate black's position. A desperate check, as black's king feels the icy grip of the pawns and the distant rook. Securing the king's safe haven with a defensive shield is paramount in this chaotic skirmish. This retreat prepares to blockade the passed pawn, and may even offer the rook a more active role on the kingside later. Launching a pawn storm to crack open the king's defenses. A desperate attempt to exploit the exposed king and draw material before the inevitable pawn push. Unleashing the king into the heart of the endgame now seems to be the only path to victory for white. Protecting the king's sanctuary while preparing for a potential pawn thrust seems to be the priority. A decisive shift begins by activating the king, seeking an outpost to escort the passed pawn. A desperate check, hoping to force a perpetual or gain time for a futile counterattack. Securing the outpost for the knight on a dark square offers a solid defensive structure. The rook seeks refuge, aiming to regroup its forces against white's encroaching pawns. The king finally ventures out, seeking to support the pawns in this tense, drawn-out endgame struggle.